Seja toda a gente bem-vindo ao Fumaca. Meu nome é Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. Comigo está a jornalista Rafaela Cortês. Falamos desde Ramallah, na Palestina, com Mudar Kassis, professor do Departamento de Filosofia e Estudos Culturais da Birzeit University, na Palestina. É também diretor da Dignity Initiative, da Birzeit University também. Esta entrevista será em inglês. Welcome to Fumaca, Mudar.
Welcome. Thank you.
In the late 18th century, the French Revolution ended the constitutional monarchy of Louis XVI, after which he was executed. The revolution had the famous slogan, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, freedom, equality, and fraternity. In 1789, the newly created National Assembly of France approved the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Point 3 of the declaration reads, "The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation." Is this the beginning of the concept of self-determination?
Not really. It might very well be around the same time when the concept of national self-determination has emerged as the self-determination of a nation. But the concept of self-determination initially was a libertarian concept, early 17th century, very early 17th century, and then it moved into liberalism, with the transposition of libertarianism into liberalism, the concept has developed. But it developed to an extent today that within the liberal framework, the current liberal framework, there is almost no meaning for individual self-determination without national, where one should assume it should be the opposite initially, but that's how liberalism has reshaped itself within the framework of the nation state and making the state central. So it is the centrality of the sovereign. It's the centrality of those who are in power that takes the form of the centrality of the sovereignty, which is the state actually, and then it's called the nation. But as a matter of fact, it's the sovereign.
Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Soviet Union, wrote in on the right of nations to self-determination in 1914, and I'm quoting, "The self-determination of nations means the political separation of these nations from alien national bodies and the formation of an independent national state." Is self-determination an anti-colonial claim?
It was used as such in more than one occasion. I don't think it on its own is an anti-colonial concept. But it was, I mean, look at what you have just quoted, Lenin. Lenin was talking at the very verge of the World War I. As a matter of fact, he was in the midst of a discussion with Rosa Luxemburg. And within this discussion, Rosa was asking, why should Polish laborers be organized in the party separately from the Russian laborers if they work at the same factories owned by the same people, etc., etc. But Lenin, who was a sort of gut politician, I would call him, thought that eventually, if a war happens, and the war happened, right, then the laborers will be standing with their nation, not with their class. They will be shooting at each other. So this is something that I would say was part of Lenin's pragmatism, if you wish, of trying to work politics the way they are. People have their belonging. We do grow up, although the nation is actually an invented construct. I mean, everybody knows that. But nonetheless, this invented construct is part of us. I mean, part of us is this invented construct, so we belong to a culture and belong to a territory, belong to a nation. Our social organization is highly politicized, and politics are centralized within the frameworks of the state that talks of itself as a state of a nation. So then the term itself, national self-determination, I think is simply a definition that people or different powers would use to their will, like almost everything else. So you have the concept and you utilize it in your own interest. So Lenin tried to utilize it together, sort of poorer nations to confront imperialist countries, Although, in fact, the confrontation on the ground was not between the countries, but between the peoples. Right? I mean, soldiers were dying from both sides always, and in the war. But I think a much.
But you wouldn't say is in itself an anti-colonial claim. Because then when you read, for example, what Woodrow Wilson, for example, in 1918, the President of the United States, said on these 14 points as the baseline of peace post-World War I, the document actually was then known as the 14 points, and he calls for the evacuation of and self-determination of nations like Belgium, France, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, Turkey, Poland. And then on this fifth point, he stated that a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. Is this the direct opposite claim when compared to Lenin in terms of the colonial or imperial way of seeing self-determination?
Not at all. I mean, look at Wilson. You won't find much colonialism in this statement, really.
I mean, if you are putting if you're giving equal weight to colonial powers and the colonized and the colonizers,
I would still give equal weight. Everybody has equal weight. I mean, the definition of the colonizer is also something that we shouldn't mix. I mean, we say, for example, Portuguese colonialism in the past. I mean, is every Portuguese person a colonialist? Really? No. I mean, obviously not. And so it's the thing is. Look, I mean, let me do a little fast forward. You probably have it in your questions, but let me do a little fast forward and remind you that the Americans and the Soviets agreed once more on national self-determination, which is after 1945. Again, it was Stalin and Roosevelt who made very similar statements, and they were in agreement. The way I would like to present this is that within the struggle, whatever kind of struggle, and regardless to who is representing who, people struggle, they try to build certain rules, like in a game. And self-determination is part of the rules of the game. Everybody is trying to use it to win the game to their own side. On its own, national self-determination only fosters the current world order, or that world order that emerged back in the roughly early 18th century, the capitalist world order, the world order that emerged with modernity, the world order that came after Enlightenment, the world order that, I mean, it has changed since then a lot, of course, but you know, if you look at it, it's like maybe we are right now something like World Order 1.10, and this emerged with World Order 1.1, something like that.
And how would you apply the concept to people, to communities, in a more like individual sense?
So the history, the development of the idea, and you know, we have to differentiate between the development of the idea of self-determination and between the development of self-determination. There's almost very little in common between the, you know, the ideal and what really happens, you know, amongst people. So the idea has been deformed, together with everything else within the emergence of this capitalist world order, the emergence of the values, cultures, ideas, thoughts, structures, institutions, powers, and what have you, that come up with capitalism, that are necessary for capitalism. And we have to remember again that capitalism on its own was also very revolutionary when it was defeating feudalism, right? I mean, at that point, it was very revolutionary. And it came up with this idea of national self-determination. So one can assume that if people are to belong to a certain state and not to God directly, this is, you know, probably a great move ahead from what we know of the Middle Ages, for example. But capitalism has also came up with this idea, probably very progressive at particularly at that point in time, and mixed it with other ideas concerning freedoms, that were meant for something else. So, for example, when I teach John Locke in my classes, it's fascinating and puzzling at the same time. I mean, you read every single passage. It's really nice. I mean, the guy says very interesting things, and you tend to see, yes, of course. And almost every time you read a passage, you'll say, yes, of course. But then you put it together and you'll find out that all of these nice things are oriented towards, giving an ideology that supports the emergence of capitalism and its development and etc. It starts very well, just like capitalism. It starts very well and ends up in a very bad place. So what happens then is that you take the individual from the libertarian idea of the freedom, something that has probably quite a bit of support. Every time somebody tells me Portugal, I think of anarchism for some reason.
I don't think people in Portugal would say the same.
But that's my very unique personal experience,
Well, but it's also because I think the anarchism history was basically removed from the revolutionary history of Portugal, I think. And so maybe you've studied different textbooks than the Portuguese people studied in school.
No, actually, the first Portuguese I ever met who became a friend of mine and taught me how to develop photos in the very old system. He was a good photographer. He was Portuguese and he was an anarchist. And this was an accident, so I thought. But then, not every second, but most of the anarchists that I ever met over my life, many of them were actually Portuguese. So maybe, I think you have a greater percentage in Portugal. So, but the point here is that this libertarian idea that could have developed very well into some anarchism did develop into something that is counter-anarchists. Not only non-anarchist, but counter-anarchist, which is the states, which is this idea of the sovereign and of the controlled, institutionalized, well-managed, etc. State. And liberal thinkers, probably starting with Locke, started taking this idea of self-determination, which was initially about the autonomy of the individual, the way it emerged as an idea, and gave it a new sense that is perplexed with the idea of the state. And see, the state means nothing without sovereignty, and so it's with the idea of the sovereign. I mean, it wouldn't be my personal argument, but many people who've studied this and wrote about this actually came up with this thread where they were trying to track, and I think successfully, but I'm not going to reproduce this now, but they were trying to track how the transposition or the change that took place in the idea of individual self-determination as a libertarian idea moved into a liberal one by reproducing or reforming some Christian notions of what the individual is. And so they tried to maintain a certain sort of reform of Christian ideas rather than to come up with autonomous ideas about what the individuals are.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? So in Christianity and in the feudal system, you're an individual that is created by God, led by God, and whose fate is sort of turned to God. So we give up God, but we don't really give him up, but we replace him with the sovereign.
We replace God with the state.
With the sovereign of the state, not even the state, but those who control the state, those who run the state. So God runs the world, and the sovereign runs the state, and the individuals play pretty much the same role, but now instead of one almighty God all over the world, we have small gods in every country who are called sovereigns, and people belong to them, etc. I'm not sure, if this is 100% defensible, this kind of idea, but it's a very interesting thread of thought that has been argued quite interestingly in the literature. I'm sure there are,
And would a world with self-determination of peoples rather than states be a world without states, without nations, and without laws?
What makes the world without laws and without sovereigns, etc., is not how you divide and regroup, different individuals, whether in one world or in different churches or in different states or in different corporations. I mean, I was just listening to the news about Shireen, about this.
Shireen Abu Akleh, who
the
was
journalist
killed
who was
yesterday.
assassinated by the Israelis, and the Palestinian Authority has declared that they are going to do the investigations and give the report to the USA because she holds an American passport, and to Qatar. I said, why Qatar? Because she works at the Qatari station. So corporate citizenship, it's
Because of Al Jazeera.
Absolutely. I mean, so
not too long ago in the United States, they consider corporations individuals. No.
No, of course. I mean, in law, this idea of a legal person that can be either a person or a company, whether a corporation or not, is actually giving equal status for me as a human being with not only flesh and blood, but also with with feelings, with emotions, with what have you, to a company. But the company has to get a status to be able to struggle with me and to hire me and to so on and so forth. But if we go back to your question, and I think it's a very important question about what makes self-determination in any collective form. Yeah. So I don't think that the collectivization that takes place in order for people to self-determine, that takes place in the discourse of the nation state and in comparison to national self-determination, is about the people. If you look at the interesting differences of who are the subjects of the nation states, they are not the people, but the peoples. So the world is divided into peoples. Not communities make people out of themselves. So we can, sit together here and say, how do we develop a people, guys? I mean, let's try to become a community. But that's why I think that there is a missing level of within the idea of self-determination over its development over the past several hundred years. The development of the idea has missed something, which is communal self-determination, which is actually practiced, but there is, if you Google it, you'll find almost nothing about it.
Is it practiced in Palestine today?
It's practiced all over. People tend to live on their own. So if you drive a car in, say, Tel Aviv and Ramallah, and why I bring this, because we have the same regulations. You don't get the same feeling on the streets at all. Yeah, people have manners of how to act on the street, how to drive, how to avoid the law, how to negotiate with the regulator, how to negotiate regulations, how to take them seriously, how much to sacrifice, how much. I mean, what are you willing for? So suppose you want to do something that would take you to prison. Yeah, what are the chances that you would take it if you were living here or in Cairo or in Lisbon or in Berlin? It's not the same. So communities do act and they manage their own lives and they negotiate things differently. But this is not unrecognized. When it started getting some recognition, unfortunately, when it started getting some recognition, it was not defined upon the notion of voluntarism. So the most important thing about a community is that it has the highest degree of voluntarism. So, you choose to which community to belong. So it's not the community, family is not a community because you are born there. Religion is not a community because you are most of the time born there. Even if you can switch in certain cases, but initially people are born into certain religions, etc. But your choice of your group of friends when you are a student, for example, you're at the university. In Birzeit, we have 15,000 students. They're not all friends, but they are, there are groups. And they know each other. They know where to find each other on campus. They know to which cafeteria they go. They know what kind of coffee they drink and so on and so forth. And so they create a community absolutely voluntarily. When the idea of communal organization came into law, and actually into even international law, it came again redefined under the pretext of more divisions, more what Alain Badiou would call identitarianism. So there's this industry of identities all the time, and there are smaller and smaller and smaller groups of people who all feel they need protection. So we all sort of seek security, and so we have demand on the state together with the critique. So new identities have been emerging, and they were called communities. And unfortunately, all these communities, if you look at what is considered to be the most progressive literature and ideas in the last sort of 2 decades, for example, you see the idea of indigeosity, for example, indigenous peoples and their rights, and they have been recognized in international law, and so on and so forth. But if you look at, so what makes them right holders? Ownership of land. That is the issue number one. It's again about property. It's not about any voluntary action that they've decided to be together. No. It's because they belong in a certain relation to something that is outside them. It's land. Plus, I mean, even if you go back to John Locke, even if you go back that liberal, you'll find out that there is no property of land. So you don't own land because you never created land. I mean, land is not a value that has been produced by people, a la Adam Smith even. I mean, what have you. But nonetheless, if you look at the criteria of this idea of indigeosity, that is very a la mode right now in critical thinking, etc. And you'll find out that it's really, I mean, it hinges on ownership, on property. So the communal aspect of self-determination is still missing. Although, we started hearing the notion of community quite a lot. I mean, it's part now. It's not only now. Actually, since 3 decades, it's been a good part of the donor jargon. World Bank talks about communities, etc. But what is meant there, and how it's implemented, and how it's worked about, it's a combination of something segregatory, more divisions, and corporate, and connected to property.
In the Declaration Principles of the Oslo Accords, signed in September 1993 between the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, and the representatives of the State of Israel, both parties agreed to recognize their mutual, legitimate, and political rights. In Article 3, it states that, and I'm quoting, "The Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza Strip may govern themselves according to democratic principles, direct, free, and general political elections." Have Oslo guaranteed the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people?
Well, it's not polite to ask such questions nowadays, really. Sorry for the joke, but of course not. Of course not. But again, like everything else, I mean, Oslo could have been. When I read Oslo the first time, I thought, look, there's so many loopholes and so many faults you can find in the text. But if what I'm reading is what I will be living tomorrow, it's much better than today. That was 1993, 94, when this was all fresh. I mean, I myself was reading it, and I consider myself.
So you were for Oslo at that point. No. We're not like Edward Said. He didn't call it the Palestinian Versailles.
No. No.
Alluding to the treaty that Germany signed after World War.
Yeah, I know. No, Edward Said had.
He called it an instrument of the Palestinian surrender.
Well, on that he probably was right. I mean, there was, of course, in the sense that the Palestinian idea initially, the idea. Sorry, I said the wrong phrase. There is no such thing as a Palestinian idea. But the ideas that was adopted among the Palestinian resistance, revolutionaries, etc., with the emergence of these movements back in the 60s mainly, and before that. I mean, so the the communists, for example, existed as Palestinian communists very early on. National movements emerged as Palestinian national movements in the 50s, probably after Nasser. There was something, but they were not strictly Palestinian. They were more Arab. Yeah, and the idea of Palestinianity, so being Palestinian, came again back only in the 70s. There was a period where these things were quite vague. And when in that period, when they were vague, and I think it's a much more telling period, because
You mean the 70s of the 20th century?
no, before the 70s, before the 70s, 50s and the 60s.
Because there are some theories that link the Palestinian, let's say, the Palestiniality, as I think you called it, as a revolt to the Ottoman Empire, so way before that time. You don't agree?
Not that I disagree, but you can find this phenomena all over the Ottoman Empire. It's not. There's nothing specifically Palestinian about it. I mean, there were revolts here, of course, but there were also more revolts in Lebanon and Syria, and in Tunisia, and etc. So there's nothing. So I don't find anything specific, but I'm not the expert on that. My point is slightly different. My point is that after the emergence of a very revolutionary wave across the world, after World War II, in the early 50s, etc., something also emerged here in this place of the world, in Palestine. And it emerged not necessarily as being Palestinian. It sometimes emerged as Arab, sometimes emerged as internationalist, sometimes emerged as Palestinian, and so on and so forth. And within that framework, if you look at the very initial slogans, for example, of the PLO, already in 1965, but they did not emerge from the nowhere. They were built on what was around there. The idea was the idea of a state of what today they call the state of all its citizens. A state, as they said, a state of Arabs, of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. There was no. It was sort of the question was the way it was set at the United Nations was as if they were three religions, right? And as if the problem was around the question of religions. So the thing was one state, one democratic state with three religions and etc. That was the slogan. This slogan, if you compare it with Oslo, then Oslo is definitely a declaration of a defeat. So we have, lost this revolutionary, progressive idea of not differentiating between people and having a state for all those who live in it. That initial idea.
And so were Palestinians closer to self-determination before Oslo than they are now?
Both, if you look at the political side of it and at the actual side of it, I think the Palestinians were closest to self-determination in the last half century, so to speak, or more, in the last 70 years. The closest they got to self-determination was during the first Intifada, 1988, 89, those 2-3 years. The Intifada is said to be 1987, 1992, but as a matter of fact, the peak of it, right, was on its maybe second and third year. And so Palestinians have practiced self-determination to the extent possible, but they have managed their own they try to do their own agriculture, their own small economies. They decided not to go to the Israeli courts, not to use Israeli police services, not to pay taxes, and to create locally based neighborhood protection teams, they called them. Unfortunately, I was abroad at that time, but from all what I know, from my, what I read and my friends and family and etc., it was actually a heaven of self-determination. A very painful one because it came with a great cost of too many deaths, imprisonments, and etc. But people were practicing what they thought was right, and it was highly both centralized. So you get this sort of program for the month, when to strike, when to do what, etc. On the one hand. On the other hand, every neighborhood would decide for its own self what to do. And so, in part centralized like one state, and in part highly decentralized like every small community decides. I'm sure you've read about that period and you've heard a lot about it. the kind of the closeness and the strength of the social fabric during that period was as at its utmost. So if you want an example of, what kind of sort of self-determination that is really reflective of the will of those who determine their own self, because, the problem with what we've been discussing so far on the question of self-determination, you see, we never discussed what determination is. We always are thinking of who is the self that determines in the self-determination. So the self, the communal self was, I think, quite clear during the First Intifada.
Mm. The Charter of the United States, which is the founding document of the UN, signed in 1945, reads in its first article, paragraph 2, the purpose of the United States are to the United Nations are to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. The right to self-determination, as we've been calling, has been protected under international law for decades, not only here in this charter, but in multiple other documents. If that's so, why is it not a reality then? And why is it not a reality in Palestine?
Because the whole system, the world order after World War II and the current, which is pretty much the current world order.
The 1.2. What was
no, this would be probably 1.6 or something. Yeah. I never counted, but yeah, it's a very interesting exercise to do that. But whatever happened, right after the Second World War, was something that was also changing the rule of the game. The rules, actually not even of the game, of a certain particular game, the rules of engagement between the East and the West. That was the most, clear thing. And these rules were designated. In a way, they looked good, of course, but on the other hand, if you read them in sort of from the different side, if you wish, they are rules about how to compete over the third world. It's not about the equality of third world countries with the first and the second worlds. It's about differences and rules of engagement between the two parties. So how are we going to compete without clashing, guys? I mean, that was, and that is called, that it got a name a little later, which is Cold War, right? It got a name. And the name, I think, is very reflective of the essence of what happened there. This idea of equal rights, I mean, this is the very, one just needs to remember what this critique of the notion of rights that Marx did in what was it? It's on the Jewish question. That's what he wrote there. He said, so the idea was, whether Jews should be assimilated or how to solve the Jewish problem in Europe, and the idea of having rights. Marx answered that if everybody has equal rights, this is actually a recipe to maintain the status quo, because if they are not equal in wealth and not equal in power and not equal in everything else, giving them equal rights will ensure that everything will stay the way it is. And so maybe equal rights in the framework of international law 1945 probably meant the same. Let's maintain the wealthier and the poorer and the more advanced and less advanced and the civilized and the uncivilized. And if you look, within that framework, of course, the defeat or the defeat of Nazism on the one hand and the victory of the Soviet Union in that war had an impact on the revolutionary notion, but this impact went in two different directions. One of it was, I think, simply revolutionary, that rarely, I'm not going to say never, but rarely realized, because every time it was about to realize, it had to take the reactionary form of the nation state, which is a very bourgeois structure. So you go, for example, look at Algeria, yeah? Lots of struggle. in Arabic we keep saying, the country of 1 million martyrs, Algeria. So many martyrs were there.
It's interesting you mention Algeria because when Charles de Gaulle, the prime minister and then president of France, recognized in 1959 the right of, and I'm quoting, the men and women who live in Algeria to self-determination, the Algerian National Liberation Front responded, we don't want self-determination, we want independence.
Yes, you see, exactly, because the idea of self-determination, national self-determination, was sort of seen at that point because of the amalgamation, because of the intertwining of different types of struggles. The common ground was national self-determination, and you have to remember the Bandung Conference and the emergence of the non-alignment movement. I mean, look at the Bandung Conference. I mean, and the Bandung Conference is a very great start for lots of things. I mean, when you look at the history of third worldism, whether in international law or in revolutionary movements or national self-determination or national liberation movements or what have you. I mean, all those histories somehow in books start with the Bandung Conference. Not because they started there, but because this was probably the first time after World War II that the idea of there is a group of nations that are not those who wrote the Charter and those who wrote the Universal Declaration and those who won or lost the war. There's the rest of the world.
Can you explain what it is, the conference?
The Bandung Conference? The Bandung Conference is a conference of a group of countries that, after that conference, got the name Third World Countries. That's where the name emerged. And it was called for by Suharto and I think Nasser of Egypt and I think Ceausescu was already there of Romania. I'm not very good at names and history, but that conference had a few very interesting things. One most important aspect of it is that they received at that conference delegates of non-existing states. So the Vietnamese revolutionaries attended that conference as a party together with Egypt, Indonesia, etc., because they had the right to a state. That was the criteria. Not who has a state, but who has the right to a state, according to international law. By the way, there was a debate about the Palestinians, and they were not invited to that conference because there was no developed slogan of independence, of an independent Palestinian state. Then, because the Palestinian question was an Arab question, and actually it still is in many different ways. So but look, I mean, Suharto was not a socialist. Suharto was not very progressive, actually. On the contrary. And Nasser was a nationalist. Nasser is also not a communist. And the Vietnamese were very communist who attended them. And China was there. China was playing a leading role in the organization of that conference. But it was also very much in tension with the Soviet Union at that point in time, etc. So that conference was a mix-up of, ideologically, there is no sense of this conference. It's not a left conference, not a right-wing conference. It's just a third world conference with all what is there in the third world. And this also should always remind us that we should not accept this image of struggle between nations, ethnicities, what have you, as if this is the story, because the story should always find something class about it. And the third world is not constituted out of one class. There are classes in the third world. And the fact that there is a non-alignment movement, for example, and there is this notion of third worldism, which is very progressive because the global south wants to stand up for the global north, so to speak, in a way. You can always have your heart on it anyway, but we should not be deceived and think that this is all nice, all clear, and all going into the same direction.
Yeah, but does that mean that international law is not a tool, or, to borrow Audre Lorde's words, master's tools, I'm referencing when she wrote that
You
the
cannot
master's
destroy
tools
the
will
master's
never
house, the
dismantle the
master's
master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change.
Yeah, but you need to read the passage after it. I'm not going to quote it now. I don't remember it, but there's something. No, I fully disagree with Audre Lorde. Fully disagree because I'm a Marxist, and I mean not because I mean Marx could also be wrong. This is not the point. But the point is his idea about using the master's tools to overcome the master was so clear in his description of what happens in the revolution. So look at the Palestinians. Look at armed struggle. What do you think Palestinians can use? Have their own sort of Kalashnikov factories or M16 factories? Of course we take the master's tools. Oh, I mean, the question is not about the tool. The question is about the technique. So how do you use it? Against whom do you use it? Whether you are able to use it, are you equipped enough to use it, and is it useful to achieve your own goal, and so on and so forth. It's not the question of the property again, not who owns this tool. There is nothing under capitalism that is not capitalist. There is nothing under colonialism that is not colonial. I am a colonial product. That's how I've been brought up. That's what I studied in school. Even my notion of critique and leftism and what have you they are quite Eurocentric in a way, and they come from the very same places where everything emerged, which is the capitalist system with its coloniality, with its classes, with its what have you. The thing is that within this system there are different positions, different interests, and different views. So. Back to your question about international law. So I think international law is, again, it's a tool that is designed by imperialists. That's how it was designed. Everybody, I mean, this is well known. Doesn't take much to prove, really. It is an imperial tool. Did the non-alignment movement use it in order to overcome it? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one fascinating place, when you look at the history of international law from various perspectives, but I mean, what I was looking at when I sort of first acquainted myself with this was I was looking at the history of the legitimacy of different types of struggle for Palestinians. You know, when the idea of the right of nations to use any available tools and techniques for self-determination became part of international law? Tehran, 1968, under the Shah. Yeah, there was a conference on the 20th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in that conference there was so much, pressure from what now is called the Global South, from the Third World, from the non-alignment movement, that we have to support these peoples and stop condemning them as, terrorist, violent, etc. If you are struggling for national liberation, then you have the right to use the tools that are accessible to you. And this was enshrined as part of international law. I mean, the recommendation was made in the Tehran conference.
But although it is written under international law, is it actually practiced? Because I mean,
It
whenever
it was until 1990, roughly speaking. It was. I mean, look, the Palestinian liberation movement used to get arms from Soviets, from the Czechs, from China, from East Germany, whatever. I mean, not from the Americans and Israel, of course, but it used to get, and there was nothing illegal about owning those weapons. There was nothing illegitimate. There was a question, of course, about whether we can use those weapons to hijack airplanes, and I agree we shouldn't. But there was no question about whether armed resistance was eligible or not eligible. It was clear.
And it is also in some places legitimate, consensually legitimate. For example, in Ukraine today. I mean, there are arms going from
Well,
states to Ukraine for
I mean,
Ukraine to
I
use.
can see your point, of course, but it's a different situation. Ukraine is a state, and it does have an army. What's the idea of being a non-state actor with arms is what has been challenged, right?
Not the occupation itself, but the fact that it's a non-state.
Yes, yes. Because if a state exists and the state is in war, nobody will tell you this is illegitimate. I mean, of course, the Americans can tell you, the American establishment can tell you whatever they want.
But why did that change in the 90s? So you're saying until the 90s, it was possible to use arms and armed violence against oppression and against occupation and against maybe colonialism, you could say.
It was
and then
standard.
after 90s.
Not only, possible, it's true, it's possible today also, but it was standard then. And it wasn't.
But why did that change in the 90s, you say?
Because there was a major attack on international law after the fall of the Eastern Bloc. The idea is very simple. If international law was an agreed upon rules of the game of the Cold War, when that game was over, or at least the United States saw it as over, they had no more reason to abide by the balances that created this game. And international law has been under rewriting, so to speak, and reinterpretation, most importantly, since then. It started with small things, I can remind you. 1992, don't quote me on the dates, but around that time, Israel bombed a UN shelter that was full with kids, I think, at Qana in South Lebanon. And Sharon explained that this was legitimate because it is retaliation. So look, the idea of post-1945 international law is not to go to retaliation. You cannot go to the UN and say, this is legitimate because it is retaliation. I thought this is really strange, and I thought that this is really actually reinterpretation of international law by Israel. Well, Israel is an outcast in international law always. I mean, that's how it emerged and so forth. But then, a little later, the United States makes an approved retaliation act in Afghanistan. Yeah, in the United Nations. And today this sort of happens, not only retaliation. Today we also hear preventive, even worse, right? Preventive wars, right? The very same thing that Israel keeps saying about 1967 war, the preventive war. Now Putin is using against Ukraine, and regardless to what's happening in Ukraine, this idea of preventive war is hilarious. So there is no room for that international law that emerged in 1945. And, legal scholars might disagree with me. But in the gist of the idea of international law, the way it emerged after 1942, which basically is to try to have less wars, less shooting, and only if, necessary, only if you are really, shot at, you can shoot back. Sort of, it's almost like, if you compare it to civil law, it's possible only under self-defense in a way. And then suddenly you talk about preventive, about retaliation, about this and that. So international law has been rewritten, but this alone doesn't explain everything. The whole how do you call it? I mean, the whole landscape of politics has changed. I mean, I've been reading something, I forgot the author, but a very nice idea, so I'll excuse myself. I'll quote him without naming him. It's
so plagiarizing.
Yeah?
He's plagiarizing in that sense. I'm kidding. I'm joking with you.
Maybe. Ethical plagiarization. But so the idea is that if you look, for example, at Italy in the 80s, until the mid-80s, you'll find out that radical leftists who are considered radical, sort of in the odds outside the mainstream, are probably those who put bombs. But if you're not putting bombs in civil places, you're eligible in a way, right? Those who were representing the far right were ineligible. Now, if you look at Italy today, if you call for equality, you are too radical. Yeah. If you ask for something like full equality, not equity or something, but equality, like really equality, you're too radical. And if you're somehow a neo-fascist, a covered neo-fascist, then you are called far right, not even radical, far right representative. So what happened is that the whole landscape of politics has moved. First of all, it was narrowed down a lot. So the range of what is acceptable has narrowed down a lot. And this is actually, I think, in part, well, I can give two reasons, and they might be even self-contradictory, but, I'm still thinking about this. One, it's because neoliberalism simply defeated liberalism, and the idea of pluralism is not supported anymore. So the room for whatever is in the mainstream is much less. But two, also because liberalism was never really for pluralism, no matter how it looked. But that needs more evidence, and I think I can make it. But regardless, things were moving to narrowing the so-called mainstream, but more importantly, not also narrowing it, but also moving it, shifting to the right all the time since the emergence of the neoliberal doctrine. So probably since the late 70s. Things go slowly, so I think it's quite hard to observe this in the late 70s per se, but already in the mid-80s you can see certain differences, and by today, there are so many natural things that I cannot imagine myself without that are called radical.
But going to the question we posed, is international law today a tool for the Palestinians? Should Palestinians use international law?
Absolutely. I mean, this idea of nationhood, right to self-determination, and as you've seen, in fact, they are not really the same. And the idea of rights and the idea of having these rights, etc., is good. The question is not whether we can use it or should use it. The question, the one thing that Palestinians should not fall in, the trap that we should not fall into, is it's not sufficient. It cannot be sufficient. You cannot rely solely on international law. International law is only one tool that has to work in an ensemble of all possible techniques, the most important of which cannot fall under international law, which is international solidarity. And solidarity is with people, not with governments. I mean, when I say solidarity, I mean popular solidarity, not with governments. Israel is too mighty in the monetary sense, technical sense, military sense, intelligence sense, etc. Defeating Israel physically by the Palestinians is impossible, I think, and you have to use some other techniques, and these techniques are obviously very much outside the territorial scope of Palestine, so to speak. So, if the international community would hold, say, sanctions against Israel, like they did against South Africa, etc., I think the Palestinian questions could have been resolved many, many years ago. But again, since the subjects of international law, the international law actors, and the new emerging international law actors that have a different name than international law, they are called the will of the international community, if I keep remembering this. And this is something I got from Chomsky, actually. The will of the international community, which is the US and its friends, and so on and so forth, insists on not having any sanctions. Not only any sanctions. I mean, look. I mean, they are trying to. They are not only trying and partially succeeding in delegitimizing something like popular boycott to Israeli products. You cannot call for that, and so on and so forth. The international law is controlled. It's not only through the Security Council and the right to veto. It's controlled because the institutions of international law are corporate institutions, as a matter of fact. The corporatism, before moving into, say, universities over the world, it moved into the UN system. It became quite corporate. And while the text is good. Like many other things. Maybe even the intentions can be good, but the question is, it's a tool that you can use and your enemy can use, and so can you sit and wait until international law solves the Palestinian problem? It will never be solved that way. But if somebody would ask me, so what is the basis that we should drop everything and attend to your problem? I will say international law. I will say that international law grants me, as a Palestinian, your obligation as an American or a German or a British government, it grants me on the basis that you have a duty to protect those who are unprotected, and a duty to implement international law, whether under international law or under international humanitarian law, and the Geneva Convention and the so-called high contracting parties and what have you. I would say this is my basis to demand this protection from states, while I would never demand solidarity from you guys, because I would say, if we are in agreement, we have to be in solidarity with each other, but I never would say it's your duty. And I never say you have to be in solidarity. That solidarity doesn't work this way. But with states, I think they have a duty and they are not fulfilling it.
Last year, in April 2021, President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, postponed the legislative elections scheduled for the following month, claiming they would be held until the participation of Jerusalem and its people is guaranteed. He was elected in 2005 for a 4-year term that ended in 2009, and the last election for the Palestinian Legislative Council were held in January 2006, which means there have not been any elections either for the presidency or the legislature for over 16 years. Are they still the representatives of the Palestinian people today?
Yes. For those Palestinians who feel they are representatives. But the question in Palestine today is not a question of representation. The question is about the lack of sole representation. There is no sole representative of the Palestinians. I mean, the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority is not broad enough to claim that, regardless to differences, this is the sole representative of Palestinians. But you see, the idea of whether there were elections or not, of course, I mean, elections are much better than no elections, and everybody knows that the Palestinian Authority was simply corrupt cancelling these elections, and they are quite corrupt to postpone them so this much, and so on and so forth. But I don't think that the question of the Palestinians is a question of representation. I mean, represent what? What the Palestinians need in terms of liberation, ending the occupation, having their own, state, etc., etc., etc. I don't think we need a representative to explain that. It is clear. So what's the role of the representative, and represent what and who? The legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority as a manager of our daily lives is something that can, I mean, to my taste, and if lawyers will hear me, they will be angry with me, but to my taste, is something like a doctor on duty. So your shift has finished, but before the next doctor comes, you cannot leave the clinic. Yeah, and I mean, what do you want? You want a people without health support, without salaries, without what? I mean, so you tell Abu Mazen, go and vanish because you have been expired in 2009. Fine. And so what next? What next? Is it a call for Israel to take over? I'm not sure this is what the Palestinians want. Is it a call for Hamas to take over? I'm not sure this is what the Palestinians want. So if you go back to the question, not about elections and their technicality and how they are usually presented as if they are sacred, it's sacred to hold elections, etc. It's good to hold elections. It's not sacred. It's not sacred because what we need, the function of elections is to pick the right managers, for the socio-political and economic sort of operation in a certain territory. That's what the government is about, right? We elect those who legislate.
It is also to vote them out, right?
Exactly, and it is to vote them out. The problem in Palestine is really different. It's because it's those who need to be voted out, Fatah and Hamas, have to agree in order for us to have elections. That's, it looks like the condition. So those who are to be voted out, have a veto over holding the elections. That's a problem. But this is a problem of management. And it's a serious problem in the Palestinian daily life. But it's not a serious political problem that, for example, would hinder the legitimacy of the Palestinian quest for liberation. It doesn't matter. We don't have to have an elected government. The PLO was never elected. And it was the legitimate representative of the Palestinians. We have to have consensus. And unfortunately, the serious problem is that neither Fatah nor Hamas, the two sort of holding powers in their hands, do not have sufficient legitimacy to represent the Palestinians in that sense. But I think the Palestinians are well represented in terms of rights, regardless to the existence of an elected or a non-elected, or the existence of a government altogether. Why do we need a government to talk about our liberation? So if you put the framework of the Palestinian question as a question of struggle between the PA and Israel, or the PA and Hamas, or whatever, you'll go into so many details where probably we don't deserve even anything. We're so unorganized, I keep saying we are a non-state with three governments. See? Yeah, the state doesn't really exist, no matter, what's written on paper, but there is no, state structure in reality. And we have the Fatah government, the Hamas government, and the Israeli government all controlling us. So we don't need one more government, really. Elected or unelected. We need freedom.
And do you need leadership as well? Because you were mentioning the PLO. Do you feel like the PLO leadership is still there?
I wouldn't mix the terms of administration and leadership. These are two different things. One is very technical, highly political, power-related. Leadership is not about power. Leadership is about being convincing. And leadership is about having allies. Leadership is about not taking office, but being able to gear, to steer, into a certain direction. It's not about who sits where. It's about who has a vision for a direction and who is convincing for the community and for the people and the nation, what have you.
Mm-hmm. And do you have that?
Leadership. No. Even if we had leadership, you wouldn't find it because there is no clarity about the vision. But that is part of the problem of the setup of the Oslo, of the post-90s, of the colonial condition. This combination of everything bad that we have here has created a situation where the main questions of the struggling of the Palestinians, which is freedom, is rarely mentioned even. Not to mention that it's not the first one. We talk about institutions, we talk about statehood, we talk about peace and war, we talk about government, we talk about elections. Tell me, when was the last report that you read about Palestine that mentions the word freedom? Which is the question. So leadership for what? If the vision is on anything but the question, anything but what the Palestinians need, how can you define leadership? Leadership is connected to a vision.
Did Oslo turn freedom fighters into bureaucrats?
Frequent flyers, they call them. Both FF, freedom. This is a South African joke, actually.
But did it?
No, I think they were... because Palestinians became... not all Palestinians, of course, but because in Palestine we started getting quite a significant portion of our old revolutionaries into consumers of revolution, if you wish, Oslo became possible. So, look, Oslo, people keep talking about Oslo as if it's the start of an epoch. I think it's an end of the one before. So it started something, of course, but we need to ask the question, not what started after Oslo, but how Oslo happened. Why did it come about? So what happened that Oslo was the option or the only option, or why did it get legitimacy? And Oslo whether we like it or not. When it happened, it was legitimate. Remember, Abu Ammar got a 70-something% vote right after Oslo, under the Oslo pretext. Yeah, I don't. Maybe people did not like Oslo as it wasn't, as big a cake as the people wanted, or as sweet a cake or nice a cake as they wanted. But it was a promise. And the most serious problem, I think, with Oslo is not Oslo itself, but the infidelity that came with those who signed Oslo. The idea that the people were given hope, regardless to whether it had proper grounds or not. Somebody promised some hope, and nothing was fulfilled. On the contrary, things came worse and worse. Why? It's exactly because Oslo was designed with nice terms, like, electing, having democracy, free elections, what have you. Although, again, I don't think this was the issue. Oslo was solving not the issue, whether it's elections, authority, no authority, crossings, and I don't know what. All of this are daily questions that need to be tackled, but the question was exactly about freedom and self-determination of the Palestinians. That is not really dealt with in Oslo at all. Yeah. It does mention autonomy. Autonomy is a vague term. You can read it the way you like. Obviously, the Palestinian read it once one way, the Israelis another way, and so on and so forth. But the question then is: so you have what you have, and what did you do after that? Let me tell you what happened after that. What happened after that is, I'm not going to call statistical figures, but we have received more than $50 billion in aid total since then, at least. I think much more, but at least $50 billion. And where did they go? How many jobs were created? How many factories have been there? How much land was cultivated with these $50 billion? Yeah, and then we're a small nation. You know what? With $50 billion we could become an industrial country. Really? You know how? I mean, do you know what does? And one time I tried to find out. So how do you call a country industrial? So it turns out that if you have roughly 1/5 of the labor power working in industrial jobs, you're an industrial country. In Palestine, this is 200,000 jobs. Yeah, it doesn't take much. We already probably have 20 or 30,000 of them, so we're left with 170. Yeah, what is the cost of creating an industrial job? One industrial job, maybe $50,000 or something. I mean, don't quote me, but I'm just talking figuratively. I mean, so the 50 billion were enough to make us an industrial country. Our economy is worse than 1995, is worse than 1986, is worse than what have you. I mean, there's more hunger, more unemployment, more bank loans, of course, more cars also, but we are economically much worse off. Politically, we are also worse off. We have less allies. People have less hope today than 25 years ago. And so what was Oslo? Oslo was a recipe of substituting the real questions with questions that are comfortable within the neoliberal framework. So questions of freedoms are replaced with questions of the exact opposite, governance. Yeah, questions of health and prosperity are replaced with questions of ability to be exploited, i.e., jobs, and international aid. Questions of, go ahead.
I wanted to interrupt you. In his book, Palestine Limited, Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territories, Tufik Haddad, Palestinian academic and author, writes that donors, the donors of the aid you were talking about, and I'm quoting, have refrained from intervening on explicitly political questions and instead claim to be engaged only in economic and technical undertakings. Implicit to this intervention was the notion that the market's invisible hand would guide Israelis and Palestinians to peace. provided the international community financial and political backed these arrangements and facilitated the creation of an adequate incentives arrangement. Can the promise of economic prosperity solve the Palestinian question?
No, the solution of the Palestinian question promises economic prosperity. Because if the Palestinians are not busy struggling and can go to their land and can cultivate and etc., there is no reason why we are a poor country. We don't have a problem with soil, with education. We do have a problem with water because it's stolen by Israel. But if they give us back what we have from water, we will have very good agriculture. And even small industries are here. They're quite good. Palestinians are equipped. We have not a bad system of higher education. We also, but we do need to have sort of professors coming from abroad. Maybe from amongst Palestinian refugees who are not allowed to come in today. We need just Israel to leave us alone and let us develop. And that is, I think, what promises prosperity. But I do disagree with what you've just read. I mean, although in general, Tawfiq's work is very, very important and very useful. But I don't think the donors were hiding their political stance. They had a very clear political stance. They've said it. I've heard it personally, and it's written that they were supporting the peace process. Is this not political? The aid was oriented to support the peace process. They've said it clear and loud. So they were, when donors used to say, and they still do, say that we don't want to interfere in political questions, it means not we don't want to do politics, but we don't want to do good politics. Yeah, we don't want to stand with the right of the Palestinians to do this and that. We want to support the deal that is not based on international law, that is called Oslo. We want to support that kind of...
The two-state solution.
The peace process, not peace. Yeah. Not even... Look, Palestinians don't care whether it's a two-state or not. And I don't think anybody cares whether it's a two-state or not. The question is, are you free or not? And, what difference does it make to, to those living in Italy, whether there is one state here or two states? What they worry about is that there is no war, that there are no refugees, no immigrants, yes, that nobody is being killed. And for us, we want to be free. And, these questions of identity, flag, the hymn, national hymn, etc., we can make two of them easily. Everybody sings what he wants, or she wants what she wants, etc. I don't think the state is the problem at all. I think the state is part of the problem, not the solution.
Do you not believe in Palestine from the river to the sea then?
I do not believe in Palestine from the river to the sea. I don't know. It depends what you mean by that. But I do believe in the Israelis, current Israeli citizens to the right to self-determination rather than confined borders, with due acceptance of Palestinian refugees back home and restitution, etc. I don't want to throw anybody into the sea, and I think that Israel has managed to create a nation, and that this nation should be recognized, and it has all the rights I have. But the problem doesn't lie in what I think. The problem lies not in what I believe Israel should or should not. What the problem lies is that I cannot do what I think I should.
The first article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, created in 1948, states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. How do you define human rights?
I think human rights are all what is needed to ensure that the human quality of humans is protected, maintained, sustained, reproduced, and ensured as a connection. I'm going to quote Hannah Arendt here, a connection between the past and the future. Yeah, the continuity. Yeah, this kind of what she calls secular eternity. So they would differ from one era to another. So what I need today in order to sustain myself probably is some Wi-Fi, also, in addition to many other things. This wouldn't have been the case 50 years ago. So I wouldn't go into listing. This idea of listing this right, that right, there is no right to Wi-Fi nowadays, and 5G, 3G, what have you, in these struggles. But the way they emerged, and I personally do subscribe in a very leftist way to the idea of natural rights, natural law. The idea that our relation with nature is, so we are an organic part of nature, and that maintaining ourselves needs the maintenance of this relationship in its dynamics, and that whatever it takes for me to be able to act in sustaining this natural condition of human life and nature, because all the human life is part of nature and it cannot stay natural without it, should be part of a system of human rights protection. Now, whether the current institution of human rights protection is about that, the answer is no. The current institution of human rights has been designed pretty much, but mostly transformed into a positivist, contract-based right. So, if the three of us now, agree contractually to kill a fourth person, would that make it legitimate? Because it's by contract. The answer is no. And the fact that people have contracts about a certain list of things that they call human rights does not really legitimize them as rights. It's not because they are enshrouded in law that they became rights. They need to be enshrouded in law because they need protection. They are rights because rights become rights because people need them to maintain their humanity, their human condition, so to speak.
And to your point, Samuel Moyn, a professor of law and professor of history at Yale University, argues in his book, Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World, that the age of human rights has been kindest to the rich, even as state violations of political rights garnered unprecedented attention due to the human rights campaigns. A commitment to material equality disappeared. In its place, market fundamentalism has emerged as the dominant force in national and global economies. Is the human rights framework, as it is right now, against equality?
Look, it doesn't matter what the framework is about. I mean, I wouldn't say that, but I say that human rights is used against equality for sure. Yeah, it's we use human rights. Human rights is frequently used as a pacifier. Stay silent, you will get something in the future. This is quite clear here in Palestine, by the way, but also if you read Moyn's book, that particular and the one before it also, about this question, it becomes very clear that, under the pretext of the fact that you have rights, you shouldn't exceed sort of your demands at a certain level, and those rights are divided into positive and negative. Some of these rights are actionable, others are not actionables, and so what I try to explain usually about the current system of human rights is that it cannot work the way it is simply, for example, because the system that declares in the very first instance that it is a set of indivisible, inalienable, and indivisible rights had to be divided into two sets as the first thing before it went into action. The covenant on civil and political rights and the covenant on social and cultural and economic and cultural rights. So the system, the protection system, the institution of the protection of human rights is in contradiction with the Declaration of Human Rights. Very simple, and this tells you something. It tells you either that the declaration was too ambitious, as somebody would tell you, or that the implementation techniques are not really designed to implement that declaration, regardless to, what we know about why this declaration was written, by whom, and for what purposes. The good thing that I keep talking about is that regardless to all of this, somebody came and utilized this very same text and this very same document and these very same principles for emancipatory purposes, for creating a better world, for creating a more equal world, for asking, the third worldism was actually about equity, not equality, right? It's about getting back some of what was sort of stolen, etc., or at least, some substitution for the kind of discrepancies that existed and so on and so forth. And they kept asking for it. But when it was delivered as a more very strict neo-colonial tool. So aid, I think. Aid, instead of aid becoming a way to sort of pay back what has been taken from the global south, it became a way to ensure that the sucking of the global south keeps going on, so on and so forth. And the term global south, where it comes from. It comes from, the first time it was used, it comes from the very interesting report that is called the Brandt Report, Willy Brandt. The Brandt Report, I think it was published in 1982, to answer the question of what are we going to do in this stagnation in Europe after the 1973. So they thought it was because of the oil prices, the embargo, then the prices. But the embargo ended and the oil kept flowing and the crisis never ended. And so this report studied the situation, and there was this commission, and they came up with this report who drew a line between the very rich and the very poor. And the line goes, of course, across the Mediterranean, and then it goes down to take Australia into the upper part, so there's like a tail, right? It's a very interesting map. You can look at it. And since then, we've been saying the global south and the global north. What happened is that the techniques, and you can start with that report, the techniques that were used in order to refresh the economy after the stagnation of the global north was to give some money and technical aid to the global south for them to be able to consume, so that the global north will be able to sell and make sort of turn the wheels of the market on, so to speak, and etc. It even describes the funniest thing. We will start with sending our experts to the global south. This will give the air companies some activity. They will be selling tickets, and these guys will be getting income. They will be sending it back home, and their families will be buying things on the market. It has been described, to that extent. And the funniest thing is that I never, because I'm not an economist, I could never understand why every economic crisis is always measured on the activity of air companies. If you remember during the beginning of the pandemic, so when did they start screaming, the crisis is too big? Yeah? Air companies are losing. They're about to go bankrupt. Yeah? And the solution that in 1982 was proposed in that report was started with the air companies, what have you.
In the last 5 centuries or more, European empires like the Portuguese have used the rationale of the civilizing mission as the basis of its colonial expansion. Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, amongst others, were seen as backward nations, incapable of socio-economic progress, and Portugal, as a developed nation or country, had the duty to help them. Is the aid work complex the modern version of the civilizing mission?
Of course. It's even more. When the British occupied India, or even Palestine, so if you go to the Ramallah municipality, and if you dig in the archives a little bit, not so much, you can find them. Take any building. Every building in Ramallah has a file in the municipality, right? So take any building in Ramallah that has been built before 1947, before the British have left here, and when everything was ruled by British rule in Ramallah, you will find a history that is quite neat. There's a court, there's a judge, there's rationale, there is some sort of rule of law under the British. The British came here with their bureaucracy. So they came here and introduced a bureaucratic system, a system of governance, management, etc. that came here. It was colonial. It was colonial, but it was working. It was working. Maintaining the streets, cleaning the city, collecting garbage, etc., was working just fine, during the British Mandate. And these were governmental duties during the British Mandate. You know what the first act that the donors did in Palestine after 1994 was? Privatize garbage collection in the poorest area of the poor Gaza. So the Middle Gaza, there is something called the Middle Gaza refugees, 3 refugee camps next to each other in the middle of Gaza. They are the poorest, the most highly populated, and the most needy areas. When I was there one time doing some work, I was almost... So I was... People explained to me in very diplomatic terms that I should simply leave them alone. I said, why? And I said, look, don't keep asking us what we need. We don't have schools. We don't have a clinic. We don't have a hospital. We don't have roads. We don't have a sewage system. We don't have clean drinking water. Why do you keep asking what we need? Stop asking, just, get into anything. In that particular area, GTZ, now it's called GIZ, GTZ started a project of privatizing garbage collection. Yeah? It's not clear even where to collect the garbage from. For the people. So I think that the donor mentality is much worse than that civilizing mission of the colonial war. Under the idea of the civilizing mission, there was some sort of a duty. The problem with aid is that it looks like a charity. You don't have to do it. You're really good. You're really nice, and that's why you give some charity. But you don't feel like you have a duty.
But is it also colonial?
The coloniality is a term that can be. It's like a harmonica. You can spread it and narrow it as you want to. Let me, instead of just sticking to words, let me just explain quickly. So I think you can think historically of what I call classical colonialism, so 19th century probably colonialism, or even up to World War II, classical colonialism, then neocolonialism, then the neoliberal forms of neocolonialism, and those have 2 stages, or 3 if you wish. I don't know. It depends how you look at it. One of them is a neo-colonialism with lots of privatization and lots of imposition, international standards, international law, removing sovereignty, globalizing trade, etc. So neo-colonialism with new formulations that remove the sovereignty of the state from the neo-colonial recipe, because the neo-colonial recipe did assume state sovereignty, and then under the neoliberal era, it stopped assuming state sovereignty. Then there is the stage when neo-coloniality reaches a certain peak and becomes what I call the neoliberal oligarchy. And when you get to the oligarchic system, there is a conflation of politics, money, and security. And you can see them in the worst systems of this world very clearly, quite clearly. And in that sense, at that point, what happens is even worse. Neo-coloniality starts using colonial techniques. That is direct war, armies, army bases, interventions, whether formal armies or sort of paid insurgents or what have you. And the natural place where all this will grow into is fascism. So that would be...
And where on the scale are we here?
We're somewhere around the neoliberal oligarchy, depending on where we're in the world.
And in Palestine?
In Palestine, we are... In Palestine, because we are, so limited, we cannot do all what we want. We are still in the very early stages of that, but yes.
What do you believe is there? Do you believe is there somewhere a path to freedom and peace for the Palestinian people? What needs to happen?
I'm sure that the future is a future of peace and freedom. The hard question is how do we get there, and how much pain and blood we will unfortunately face on the way. And my thinking is that the Palestinian question is embedded very strongly in the global world question. I think the world is at a verge of what I call a bifurcation. We're either moving towards something that is more just, more equal, more socialist, if you wish, more related to the will of the majority of the inhabitants of our planet, of people, or towards fascism. As one more escalation of the current neoliberal oligarchy before things burst out and eventually will change. Whether we go through the more painful track, which will lead to a war and revolutions and what have you, and end up somewhere in, the world has to settle. The current differences in income, the polarities of the world, whether between the poor and the rich, or between the south and the north, or between the wealthy and unwealthy, and so on and so forth, is so big that the world cannot be stable like that. The differences are so huge. So the question is, which way do we go to stabilize? Either, like a bomb, you burst out and then everything settles naturally, so to speak, under the way gravity takes it down. Or you do it through some smart kind of engineering techniques as and you plan it and you do it with less destruction, less pain, less blood, less victims, and what have you.
Is it reform versus revolution?
If reform wasn't the liberal technique, I would say yes, but I want to say reform without being understood as promoting liberal techniques, because liberal techniques will lead to devastation. I'm talking about reform in the sense of, look, is it something about the history of Portugal that I remember? I heard there was a period when you had in Portugal military coups without a single bullet shot, right?
That's the official narrative, more or less. But I mean, the Portuguese Revolution of '74, well, it was the result of hundreds of thousands of people dead in the colonial wars, right? Yeah. Even in that day, the 25th of April of '74, 6 people at least were killed. But yeah, we call it like the peaceful, bloodless revolution, because on that day...
But I'm talking about pre-1974. I mean, was it pre? Yes, I think. So there was an era where I think, that's at least what I was told. I've never read this anywhere, but I was told the story. So if a few generals would come and sign a document, yeah, and then they would give it to the rest and tell them, we are the majority. Here are the signatures. So there's no need to fight. So they would go and these would take into the palace. And then the older group would, go and find 2 of those who yesterday signed or whatever and take it back. So what I'm saying is that you can do even military coups, yeah, by calculating what is it that you need and what is it that really can work or not work. I'm not talking about compromises here. I'm not talking about reforms to avoid radical change. On the contrary, it is so clear that the change that is needed today is extremely radical. Not only radical, but extremely radical. Because, you cannot create equality between people who are so unequal without, redistributing wealth. It's evident, right? The question is whether you do this by law, by martial law, or under the threat of a gun. Yeah, I mean, at one point, and whether you need to convince people that we need to do this by explaining, or just keep it going for a few more years, and people will burst on their own out of hunger, out of poverty, and etc. And they will go down to the streets and they will die in thousands. But then the system will change, etc. I hope that we will have less blood. I cannot see how this can happen within the current so much prevailing depoliticization of ourselves, of our youth, there is no political organization. There is much talk, like what we're doing right now, but there is no political organization. So those who want to make the change cannot be unorganized and succeed in doing the change. And so really my hope is that we can come to a realization of the need of proper political organizations. And I mean political. I don't mean organize over this issue or that issue. We are all against the destruction of the environment. We are all against war in principle, right? But it's not a question of when this war happens to me as a Palestinian, I will shout, and if it happens to somebody in Brunei, I will just close my eye, and if the refugee is Ukrainian, I will make a big fuss, and if the refugee is Syrian, I will say we don't need you, etc. It's not a pick and choose thing. It should be a principled action, and it should be an action of class-based action. And I don't mean class-based only as in a question of to which class do you belong, but in a question of a class of issues. So, as you said, environment, war, desertification, neoliberal oligarchies, military financial juntas. All of this. I think this is a class of issues that we are facing in the current world order under the neoliberal oligarchy. But in order to face it, we need to face one of the things that this oligarchy was most successful at doing, which is depoliticizing the discourse. This idea of the third way, and no right, no left, and forget ideology, etc. This doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work anymore. The question is, when will it reproduce? When can we reproduce? And again, it's very important to keep remembering for many people who think about these things with nostalgia. I'm sorry to be lecturing here, but this is important for me. I would like to say it. History doesn't have a reverse gear. You cannot go back to the 70s or the 60s or the 80s. We have to create a new modality. But this modality has political organization. It doesn't have to be the same old, maybe corrupt parties of then. It doesn't have to be the same type of leadership. It doesn't have to be the same paternalism. It doesn't have to be the same Cold War or what have you. But it has to be a well-organized, popular work with leadership and with theoretical understanding. It's not about slogans. It's not about, whatever. It's not about, wow, how good it is. It's about a theoretical understanding and a design of practice. I'm going a bit Gramscian here, if you notice, right? A design of practice, a notion of praxis, where we think, we realize, and then we design and we act in order to prohibit the emergence of a new fascism. I'm not talking even about neo-fascism. I'm talking about a new fascism. We have to prohibit this, or else things will burst anyway, a little later.
Thank you so much. Shukran.
You're most welcome.
Esta entrevista foi preparada por mim, pela jornalista Rafaela Cortês, a Margarida David Cardoso fez a edição, o Bernardo Afonso foi responsável pelo som. Fazem ainda parte da equipa Fumaca Danilo Tomás, Frederico Rocha, Joana Batista, Luís Marquês, Maria Almeida, Nuno Viegas e Pedro Miguel Santos. A música é dos Lutz Fever. Queremos fazer do Fumaca a primeira redação profissional totalmente financiada pelas pessoas. Se queres fazer parte da nossa comunidade, vai a fumaca.pt/contribuir. Até já.